7 times she said, "I do." 7 vows, 7 men, 7 chances at happiness. And yet, behind those 7 marriages stood a fortune of nearly $900 million and a life that unraveled anyway. This is the story of Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress who had everything money could buy, except the one thing she spent her entire life chasing: love. Barbara Hutton was born into excess. Her grandfather, Frank Winfield Woolworth, built a retail empire that turned 5 and dime stores into a global phenomenon. When Barbara inherited her share, she became overnight one of the richest women in the world. But wealth arrived wrapped in tragedy. Her mother died when Barbara was just a child. The circumstances were whispered about, never spoken plainly. A scandal, a shadow, a silence that lingered in every grand hallway she would later inhabit. Her father? Distant, absorbed in his own world. So Barbara grew up surrounded by servants, chandeliers and marble floors, but starved of affection. By the time she came of age, the world didn't see a lonely girl. They saw an opportunity. And Barbara? She mistook attention for love. The loneliness that defined her childhood became the invisible wound that would never truly heal. In the vast Woolworth estates, young Barbara wandered through corridors lined with priceless paintings and antique furniture imported from European palaces. Every object around her whispered of wealth and status, yet none could answer the question that echoed in her young heart. Why doesn't anyone stay? The nannies who raised her were paid employees, rotated in and out according to her father's whims and her various relatives' schedules. They taught her manners, dressed her in the finest clothes, and ensured she looked the part of an heiress. But when the day ended, they went home to their own families, their own children, their own lives. Barbara was simply their job. The tutors who educated her filled her mind with languages, literature, and the social graces expected of someone in her position. She learned to speak French fluently, to play piano with technical precision, to curtsy at exactly the right depth for exactly the right rank of nobility. But nobody taught her the one skill she would need most desperately: how to recognize sincerity in a world where everyone wore a mask around money. She learned early, painfully early, that people behaved differently in her presence. Smiles came quicker when she entered a room. Laughter sounded just a bit too enthusiastic at her childish jokes. Promises flowed like honey from the lips of distant relatives and family friends, each one positioning themselves for future favor. Everyone wanted to be near her, to be associated with the Woolworth name and fortune, but nobody seemed to want to know her, the actual girl behind the inheritance. This distinction, subtle but devastating, would haunt her for decades to come. She became hyper-aware of the change that came over people when they learned who she was. The initial genuine interaction would shift, almost imperceptibly, into something calculated, something transactional. And with each occurrence, a small part of Barbara's ability to trust withered. As she blossomed into a beautiful young woman with delicate features and soulful eyes, the press dubbed her the poor little rich girl. The nickname was meant to be ironic, even mocking. How could someone with such obscene wealth possibly be pitied? But it captured a truth that Barbara herself was only beginning to understand. All the wealth in the world couldn't buy her what she craved most desperately: to be loved for who she was, not what she had. By her early 20s, Barbara had become a fixture in society columns. Her every outfit was photographed and analyzed. Her attendance at parties made them newsworthy. Her beauty and wealth made her the most eligible heiress in the world, and the suitors came circling, drawn like moths to the brightest, most dangerous flame. Her first "I do" came wrapped in royalty. Prince Alexis Mdivani was charming, exotic, everything a young heiress might romanticize. But he was also something else: broke. To him, Barbara wasn't just a bride, she was a lifeline. Their marriage was less a union, more a transaction. Lavish spending followed: jewelry, estates, parties that glittered with European aristocracy. Barbara paid for it all, and when the money flowed, so did the illusion of love. But illusions don't last. Alexis came from Georgian nobility, though his claim to the title prince was questionable at best. His family had fled to Paris after the Russian Revolution, their wealth and lands seized, their status reduced to a name and fading memories of grandeur. What remained was the accent, the bearing, the practiced charm of someone who had learned that survival depended on marrying well. He courted Barbara with the precision and strategy of a military campaign. Flowers arrived daily at her hotel suite, always her favourites, always with handwritten notes that quoted poetry and promised devotion. He appeared at the same social events she attended, as if by coincidence, always immaculately dressed, always ready with a witty observation or a gallant gesture. He spoke to her in French, which made everything sound more romantic, and he told her stories of his aristocratic childhood that painted pictures of a sophisticated world she desperately wanted to belong to. Barbara was only 21 years old, young, naive, and desperately wanting to believe that someone could love her without calculation. She threw herself into the role of princess with enthusiasm that was both touching and tragic. She redesigned entire estates to suit Alexis's taste, filled them with the specific antiques he admired, hired staff based on his preferences. She funded his various business ventures without question, signing checks that would have made her advisors weep if they had known the full extent. She bought him cars, horses, artwork and clothing from the finest tailors in Europe. She hosted parties that became legendary, where champagne flowed freely and the guest list read like a who's who of European aristocracy. For a brief, shining moment, Barbara believed she had found it: love, acceptance, a place where she belonged. But behind the fairy tale facade, cracks appeared almost immediately. Infidelity rumors surfaced within months of the wedding. Alexis was often absent, his excuses growing thinner and less believable with each disappearance. When confronted, he would turn cold, his charm evaporating to reveal the calculating stranger beneath. Coldness replaced affection. The fairy tale cracked. The man who had once quoted poetry now barely spoke to her unless he needed something. The husband who had promised eternal devotion was spotted around Paris with other women, not even bothering to hide his indiscretions. The prince who had swept her off her feet now treated her with a dismissive contempt that cut deeper than any knife. Friends tried to warn her. Her lawyers and advisors expressed grave concerns about the financial hemorrhaging. But Barbara had invested more than money in this marriage. She had invested hope. To admit failure would mean admitting that love, once again, had eluded her, that once again she had been wanted for her fortune, not herself. Eventually, it ended the only way such marriages do, with a divorce, and a lesson Barbara would never fully learn. Enter Count Haugwitz Reventlow, another title, another promise of sophistication, another man drawn to her fortune. At first, this marriage seemed different. They had a son, something Barbara had always longed for, a piece of real connection, a reason to believe. The Count was Danish nobility, tall and imposing, with ice-blue eyes, and the kind of aristocratic bearing that made Barbara feel she had finally found someone worthy of her station. Unlike Alexis, whose title was questionable, the Count's lineage was impeccable, traced back centuries through Danish royal courts. This lent him an air of legitimacy that Barbara found reassuring. Their courtship was more subdued than her whirlwind romance with Alexis, which Barbara interpreted as maturity and genuine feeling rather than performance. The Count didn't shower her with poetry or grand gestures. Instead, he spoke of duty, legacy, and the importance of producing an heir. At the time, Barbara found this refreshingly honest. She didn't realize she was trading one cage for another. Their wedding was a grand affair, covered extensively by newspapers around the world. Barbara wore a gown that cost more than most people's homes, and the ceremony took place in a historic European castle that the Count insisted upon. She signed the checks without hesitation, still hoping that this time would be different. When her son Lance was born, Barbara experienced a joy she had never known. Here, finally, was someone who would love her unconditionally, someone who needed her for more than her money, someone who was part of her in a way that could never be transactional. She poured all her maternal instincts, all her stored-up capacity for love, into caring for him. She was determined to give him the childhood she had been denied, filled with affection and presence and genuine connection. But behind closed doors, the story darkened. The Count was controlling in ways that were subtle at first, then increasingly overt. Cold in his affections, calculating in his demands. At times, his control turned cruel. He criticized Barbara's appearance constantly, commenting on her weight, her choice of clothing, the way she styled her hair. Nothing was ever quite right. He isolated her from friends he deemed unsuitable, which eventually meant most of her friends. He made decisions about their son without consulting her, treating her more like an employee in the nursery than a mother, certainly not as a partner. Barbara, already fragile from her first failed marriage, found herself trapped in a gilded cage. The emotional damage ran deep, the kind that doesn't leave visible scars, but reshapes a person from the inside. She began to withdraw into herself. She ate less, her appetite disappearing along with her self-worth. She smiled less, the light in her eyes dimming. She believed in herself less, the Count's constant criticism becoming a voice in her head that echoed long after he left the room. When the marriage collapsed, it didn't just take another piece of her wealth, it took something far more valuable, her sense of safety. The custody battle over Lance was brutal and extraordinarily public. The Count painted Barbara as an unfit mother, using her wealth and lifestyle against her. He brought up her spending, her parties, her first divorce. He implied instability, carelessness, selfishness. Each accusation was a knife wound to Barbara's heart, because the one thing she had tried to do right, the one relationship she had poured her whole soul into, was being used as evidence of her failure. Though they eventually reached an agreement that gave Barbara visitation rights, the damage was irreversible. Her relationship with her son, which should have been her greatest source of joy and connection, was forever complicated by the bitterness of the divorce and the Count's ongoing interference. Lance would grow up torn between two parents, never quite belonging to either, carrying his own wounds from the battlefield of their failed marriage. Then came Hollywood. Cary Grant entered her life like a beam of light breaking through storm clouds. He was different, or so it seemed, charismatic, elegant, already successful. For once, Barbara wasn't marrying someone who needed her money. Cary Grant was, at that time, one of the most famous actors in the world. His face graced movie posters across continents. His name alone could sell out theaters. He was handsome in that classic Hollywood way, with a charm that seemed effortless and a wit that could make anyone laugh. Most importantly, he was financially independent, wealthy in his own right from his successful film career. Their courtship was relatively brief but intense. Grant was attentive in ways her previous husbands had not been. He actually listened when she spoke, remembered the small details she shared, asked follow-up questions that proved he cared about her answers. He made her laugh, genuinely laugh, in a way she hadn't in years. He seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts, her feelings, her opinions on things that had nothing to do with money or status. And for a brief moment, she tasted something close to real happiness. Their marriage was the most genuine of the seven. Friends and acquaintances who knew them both remarked on how they seemed truly fond of each other. There was an ease to their interactions, a natural rhythm that had been absent from Barbara's previous marriages. They could sit in comfortable silence. They could finish each other's sentences. They laughed at inside jokes and made plans for a future that felt, for once, possible. But even genuine love can falter when built on fragile foundations. Barbara's insecurities, years in the making, began to surface like cracks in a dam. Fear of abandonment, fear of not being enough. The weight of her past pressed into their present. She became possessive, needing constant reassurance that he loved her, that he wouldn't leave, that he wasn't with her for the wrong reasons. She questioned his whereabouts when they were apart, his friendships with other women, his commitment to their marriage. The questions came from a place of deep pain and fear, but they created the very distance she was trying to prevent. Grant, for his part, was patient at first. He understood, intellectually at least, where her fears came from. But understanding isn't the same as being able to live with it indefinitely. The constant need for validation, for proof, for reassurance began to wear on him. And he had his own insecurities, his own demons, his own complicated relationship with intimacy and trust. Two wounded people, no matter how much they care for each other, cannot always heal together. Sometimes the wounds are too deep, the patterns too ingrained, the fear too overwhelming. Eventually, even Cary Grant couldn't hold it together. They separated, and Barbara was left wondering if even love that felt real could slip away. What hope was left? If even with a good man, a man who didn't need her money, a man she genuinely cared for and who seemed to genuinely care for her, if even that couldn't last, then perhaps the problem wasn't them. Perhaps the problem was her. Perhaps she was simply unlovable. This thought, more than any divorce settlement or public scandal, devastated Barbara in ways she would never fully recover from. Next came Igor Trubetskoy, another prince, another dream. This time, it was adventure she chased, fast cars, European glamour, a life that moved too quickly for reflection. Igor was younger than Barbara's previous husbands, athletic and energetic, with a restlessness that matched her growing desperation. He raced cars professionally, living with the kind of reckless abandon that Barbara found intoxicating after the emotional heaviness of her marriage to Grant. Igor didn't ask deep questions or require emotional intimacy. He offered escape. After the painful introspection that had characterized her relationship with Cary Grant, Igor's superficiality felt like relief. They traveled constantly, Monaco, Paris, the French Riviera, never staying anywhere long enough for the relationship to be examined too closely. They attended races where Igor competed, parties that lasted until dawn, social events with an almost manic frequency. Barbara threw herself into this whirlwind lifestyle, perhaps hoping that if she moved fast enough, she could outrun her sadness. She funded Igor's racing career, bought him cars and equipment, bankrolled the lifestyle that made their constant motion possible. But speed has consequences. The excitement faded, the passion cooled. Perpetual motion is not the same as progress, and eventually, the dizzying pace couldn't hide the emptiness at the center. And once again, Barbara found herself staring at the same ending. Distance, disconnection, divorce. By now, a pattern was forming, obvious to everyone except Barbara herself. Or perhaps she saw it but couldn't or wouldn't break the cycle. Perhaps hope was the only thing she had left, even if it meant hoping for the same thing to produce different results. Marriage number 5 brought Porfirio Rubirosa into her life. Rubirosa was notorious, charming, dangerous, magnetic. Women fell for him easily. Barbara fell harder than most. Rubirosa had a reputation that preceded him like a warning siren Barbara chose not to hear. He had been married to wealthy women before, most notably Doris Duke, another heiress whose fortune rivaled Barbara's own. Rumours of his prowess, both romantic and in his ability to separate women from their money, circulated openly in the elite circles Barbara inhabited. He was everything her lawyers and advisers warned her against, which perhaps made him even more appealing. After all, none of their approved choices had worked out. Why not try the opposite? He brought excitement and danger and a raw sensuality that Barbara's previous marriages had lacked. A sense of being desired in a primal, uncomplicated way. But desire isn't devotion, and passion isn't permanent. Their marriage was brief, turbulent, expensive. Rubirosa lived lavishly on her dime, unapologetically so. Cars, the fastest and most expensive available. Horses for polo, his favourite sport. Endless indulgence in the finest wines, the best restaurants, the most exclusive clubs. He spent Barbara's money with a casualness that was almost admirable in its audacity, and when the money slowed, when Barbara's advisers finally convinced her to tighten the purse strings, so did his interest. It ended quickly. Another heartbreak, another fortune diminished. By the 6th marriage, something had changed, not in her choices, but in her expectations. Baron Gottfried von Cramm entered her life, but this union wasn't built on love. It was convenient, a marriage of appearances, of mutual benefit. Von Cramm was a former tennis champion, sophisticated and cultured, with impeccable manners and an aristocratic lineage. But there was an understanding between them that was more practical than passionate. Some historians have suggested that von Cramm was homosexual, and the marriage provided him with social cover, while providing Barbara with companionship and status. There was companionship, certainly, but not passion. Stability, of a sort, but not intimacy. Barbara had begun to settle. Not for happiness, she no longer expected that, but for less pain, for a relationship that wouldn't devastate her when it ended, for someone who would be present without demanding the emotional vulnerability she no longer had to give. And even that didn't last. Even the low bar of less painful couldn't be maintained. The seventh and final marriage was to Raymond Doane. By this point, Barbara was no longer the dazzling heiress the world once envied. Time, heartbreak, and loss had taken their toll. Her fortune, eroded through decades of lavish spending, generous divorce settlements, and exploitation by those she trusted. Her health, fragile, weakened by years of eating disorders and the physical manifestation of emotional trauma. Her spirit, exhausted in a way that sleep could never fix. Doane was significantly younger, an artist with little money and even less fame. Some said he was a fortune hunter like the others, but by this point there was far less fortune to hunt. Others suggested he genuinely cared for Barbara in her diminished state. The truth, as always, was probably somewhere in between. This marriage felt less like hope and more like resignation, a final attempt to not be alone. But loneliness has a way of following you, no matter who stands beside you. It ended like the others, quietly, inevitably. When the marriages were over, the silence began. Barbara Hutton, once worth nearly $1 billion, found herself dwindling financially and emotionally. Her spending had been relentless, her generosity often exploited by those who saw her wealth as inexhaustible. By the end of her life, the vast fortune she inherited had largely disappeared. But the greater loss wasn't monetary, it was internal. She struggled with health issues that had plagued her for years, but now intensified. Eating disorders that had started as a response to the Count's criticism had never truly been addressed, and now her body was paying the price. Loneliness that echoed louder with each passing year, no longer drowned out by the chaos of courtship and marriage and divorce. The world that once surrounded her with admiration slowly drifted away. Fair-weather friends who had enjoyed her parties and her generosity found reasons to be elsewhere when she could no longer provide either. Friends became fewer, rooms became quieter, and the grand estates that once hosted glittering parties, those too were mostly gone, sold off to pay debts, or simply because maintaining them alone felt pointless. Barbara spent her final years in relative isolation, living in hotels rather than the grand estates she once owned. The woman who had once commanded the attention of the world's press, whose every outfit and appearance made headlines, now avoided cameras and public spaces. Her body, weakened by years of poor eating and the physical toll of emotional stress, grew frail. The vibrant young heiress with the beautiful smile had become a ghost of her former self, thin to the point of fragility, her eyes holding the sadness of someone who had searched for something all her life and never found it. Barbara Hutton's life poses a question that still lingers today. What is wealth if it cannot buy peace? She had access to everything, luxury beyond most people's imagination, status that opened every door, influence that could make things happen with a phone call. But she lacked the one foundation that gives those things meaning, connection, real, unselfish, unwavering connection. Her marriages weren't just relationships, they were attempts to fill a void left in childhood when affection should have been freely given, but instead was transactional or absent. Attempts to prove she was worthy of love, to demonstrate that despite what she feared in her darkest moments, she was more than her bank account. Attempts to silence the quiet fear of being alone that had haunted her since she was a child, wandering those empty hallways. But money, no matter how vast, cannot heal wounds it didn't cause. It cannot replace the affection that should have been given freely in childhood. It cannot teach someone how to recognize genuine love when they've never truly experienced it, when every relationship in their formative years was colored by the awareness of wealth. Barbara Hutton wasn't destroyed by her 7 marriages. The truth is more subtle, more tragic, more human. She was destroyed by the hope each one carried and the disappointment each one delivered. Each marriage was a new chance, a fresh start, a reason to believe that this time would be different, and each divorce confirmed her deepest fear, that she was fundamentally unlovable, that her worth began and ended with her inheritance. 7 times she believed, 7 times despite everything, despite the pattern, despite the warnings, she believed that this man, this marriage, this moment would finally be the one. 7 times she trusted, opening her heart even as it became more damaged, more scarred, more fragile. 7 times she lost, and each loss took something from her that could never be recovered. And in the end, she was left with the one thing she feared most. Not poverty, though she died with far less than she inherited. Not scandal, though her life provided plenty of fodder for gossip columns. But emptiness. The vast, echoing emptiness of a life filled with everything except what mattered. 7 marriages, $900 million, and a life that proves some tragedies aren't about losing everything, they're about never truly having what mattered in the first place.